Hey, hello. My name is Annika Lundqvist with Pedestrian Space. Pedestrian Space is a platform and NGO dedicated to issues of walkability and more broadly urban resilience. Today I'm here with Professor Lawrence Davis, and we are here to talk about his book, Rewriting Exurbia, New People and Aging Sprawl. Let's see the book, which
Oh,
I just
okay. Yeah.
read. There we go. I was so curious about this book. I've been in touch with ListLab, the publisher. When I post this, I will include a link to the book. I was extremely curious about this book. As a child of the suburbs, as a person who grew up in North American suburbs, currently relocated from the urban center of a large Polish city to the Polish suburbs, um, I was really fascinated by this, in what I sort of seemed like this solutionary exploration of suburban space. Um, and I was really curious to read the book, which I will say is in a very engaging layout. I want to let you know, Professor Davis, I really found that layout, first of all, very engaging. A lot of photos, a lot of rich visuals. So that was very engaging, and I think it's really good for this type of space to have that. So, I want to start off, first of all, for listeners to hear how you would define the terms. I think that's a good place to start off because the book
Sure.
is titled Exurbia. So, suburban, exurban, peri-urban, how do we distinguish and define?
Well, thanks for having me, Annika. Well, most people know what a suburb is, right? And it's a very old term, thousands of years old. It was any kind of development outside the city walls. And frequently, historically, through most of history, that's been stuff that people didn't want happening in the city. Tanneries, factories, slaughterhouses, sometimes very low income kind of housing, if you want to call it that, was happening there. Of course, in the middle of the 18th century, a kind of typology emerges, particularly out of Britain, and then this gets exported to the United States and Canada and in Australia, mostly the English-speaking world, where, actually the wealthy lives outside the city. The city wall is no longer important, but still culturally, subordinate to the center, economically subordinate to the center. What happens after the Second World War is a kind of transformation of that, a kind of diffusion of that, and at least in North America, there's a series, a kind of urban pattern develops where there's a series of different poles or different centers that are kind of competing with one another. An example I give is Irvine, California, which is the third largest central business district in the state of California, which is, as you know, about the fourth or fifth largest economy in the world, depending on which magazine you read that week. So there you go. Maybe a new term needs to happen. I like the term exurbia because it means out of or beyond, separation from a former state of being, a place with no center. It's a kind of description of diffuse, non-centered urbanism. That's my definition that I prefer and why I like that term.
Okay, that's very interesting. So, how did this get started? I mean, I'm guessing your
Sure.
interest in this space goes far beyond from when you started the book, but what was the aha moment when you felt that this needs to be in a book?
Well, I was always interested in trying to develop some kind of rough and ready theory, particularly for practicing architects to design in those kinds of areas. Most of the projects I got when I got out of school were in diffuse environments, and not in places where the buildings were close together, which is where most of the projects in school had happened. So, I taught a course, a seminar on the topic about the history and theories of suburbia. Um, but then actually a lot of trips, mostly to Southern California, were very influential in my thinking, seeing things in Latino neighborhoods and in Asian suburbs, places that are called ethnoburbs by the sociologist Wei Li, and how they began to adjust, particularly the functions. I mean, frequently what I was looking at was what most architects would call kind of messy, right? But that wasn't the point. The point was that they were reimagining what we do in those kinds of places. And so my sort of aha moment, to use your term, was to sort of say, oh, I'm going to maybe try and develop a series of strategic theories about what we could do. For instance, mix up the functions that happen in suburbia, maybe create inner block solutions so you can create a series of informal pedestrian connections across blocks that we didn't have before. Really think about the horizontal surface as not just one function, i.e. grass, but many functions that could happen on that surface. So in all those things, anything that would begin to enhance social interaction was sort of in play. Again, I take these things and maybe look at them a little more abstractly and say to myself, well, these could be really great tools to begin a conversation about thinking about what the next generation of this existing built environment might be. To me, I think that's really the key. Frequently the solution is, let's tear it down and build something else, or let's keep moving further and further out. But if you know, successful cities often reinvent themselves. And I would argue that this kind of city, which is everywhere, needs to maybe, we're at a moment where it needs to sort of reinvent itself, reimagine its form, its purpose, its spatial relationships.
Right. And that's so important what you said. This kind of city is everywhere. Before we started recording, we were reflecting on the fact that you lived in Florence, Italy for several years. There's suburbs there. There's suburbs here in Poland. There's suburbs in France. There's suburbs everywhere. So for me, the work you're doing is appears to be pioneering. This connects to another question I have. I wrote it down because it's a little bit lengthy. This is now about stigma. Stigma. I'm a suburban kid. I grew up in the suburbs. However, I'm an urban
Me too.
researcher also. Okay.
In
Yeah.
Ohio, not in
Uh,
California.
Ohio, yeah. We're all across the nation of USA, like loads of suburban kids, now adults, and some of us apparently doing research on this space. So I hope to one day. But in the meantime, one thing I've observed is that the suburbs really carry a stigma for many urbanists, many researchers, even I would say, who dismiss it with a bias towards proper city space, lack of interest. I think the sort of the stigma that the suburbs carry doesn't inspire the same interest as like, oh, lively center city urban transformation. However, for some of us, obviously it does. That's why we're sitting here talking about your book. That's one reason I was drawn to your book is that you're exploring the challenge of the space, but also solutions from this really interesting lens of space and culture. I will admit I did not know the term ethnoburb before I read your book. So I appreciate that. I think there's a lot to learn from. I think a lot of people may not have heard this term. So I'm curious how we can stimulate more interest in solutions for sub and exurban space among students, professors, researchers, practitioners, etc.
Well, it's a great question. It's an important question, and I think it's a very worthwhile kind of thing to try and do. The word ethnobirth, by the way, comes from Wei Li, who's a sociologist. I think she currently teaches at Arizona State, and she first used the word in a paper she gave in the late 90s. So it's been around. And what was really interesting to me was to see how other people outside the field of those who design the built environment were really looking at these kinds of places as they were changing. As I said before, people coming in from other traditions and bringing in different spatial practices. In terms of stigma, yeah, it's been around. I mean, there was a lot of writing, Lewis Mumford and things like this from the middle of the 20th century, sort of lamenting the demise of the city. And so this created a kind of narrative that was out there that people could use and pick up on, and then, develop different strategies for sort of reinforcing the image of the city, right? The urban crisis of the late 70s and the 80s. People like Colin Rowe, the Career Brothers, people like that were very much enamored with this idea of restoring or recreating the 19th century city. And they had some very legitimate points, by the way. I mean, I support their pedestrian bias, but I also think that what's interesting about the sort of less dense city, physically dense city, is that you actually have a lot more opportunities to change things, to adapt to things. Margaret Crawford, in an interview for an exhibit in Barcelona, said, in the future, there might be many kinds of suburbia. Right now, we have like one, right? The house on the lawn, zoned single family house on a kind of quarter acre lot, if you will, as the typology, as the urban identity of that kind of community. But in the future, that could change. Still, I mean, I've been saying this now for about 10 years or 15 years, and I get a lot of pushback. There's no question. People have this narrative locked in their minds. Here's another thing I think that's really important in terms of narratives. We are really at a point, not just in architecture, but in many kinds of cultures where we need to construct new narratives or we're going to be at each other's throats. We're not going to be able to move forward. We're going to say, this is the way we should live, not your way. And instead, we need to have a kind of more hybrid attitude, not just in architecture, but in everything, right? That we're in an age where we have to stop being cynical about things like that and really look for positive relationships between people in order to move forward. And I also think it's extremely exciting too and fun. But also, there's a kind of self-preservation voice in my head saying, yeah, we better kind of do this too. Otherwise, we're going to be in trouble. I mean, Europe is experiencing similar things with immigration, right? How do we handle this? What are the sort of things that we have to agree on? What are the things that work? Try to build new collective identities in that way. Here's one thing about suburbia that's very interesting. Um, it is, all suburbs have nature in them, but what nature means in one culture, in terms of its kind of meta narrative potential, compared with another culture, is different. So, East Asian traditions have a certain way of looking at nature. Latino are, which are extracts or connect intersections of European and Mesoamerican cultures have another way of looking at nature. And of course, the sort of Judeo-Christian trajectory of nature from Europe is a whole nother thing. And so, the tree is there, but what the tree means is different. Same, you could say the same, I suppose, for geometry in the built environment too. But I think finding those things that we actually have in common and then using them as ways of creating, again, new narratives is really, really important. Not just to make a nice built environment to inhabit, but I think to have a better society, actually. So,
Absolutely. I absolutely agree with you. And I love that about the more hybrid attitude of doing many things. I think it's part of our survival as well, our thriving, but yeah, literally our survival. And I like the focus on nature. And in your book, it's fun to see how the lawns manifest or are changed in different ethnoburbs, the different type of the different treatment of nature, on the lawns of different really interesting. It's so great you have the photos in there. I'm very visual, but really interesting to see that. And to see the use of courtyard space. You mentioned something. I have to go back to something you mentioned because this is pedestrian space and we're all about walkability. You mentioned the informal pedestrian connections between blocks that we
mhm.
didn't have before. So where did you see that? This is something you observed in these areas.
I actually, it's not something I observe. It's probably more something that I proposed. But I did notice in particularly Latino ethnoburbs that the interior of the block or the backyard could be maybe a kind of social program. There was a wonderful restaurant in Corona, California called Bar de Pan, which, it was now above the radar before it, I think, had been up below the radar, and is a kind of social space. Now imagine connecting those across the block, or imagine having other kinds of programs in the center, a garden. We were talking about gardens earlier. There could be other kinds of workspaces, not anything sort of heavy manufacturing, but other kinds of things that would make the center of that block uh, traversable.
Mhm.
And I think that could also then, particularly if you're adding in more residential density, you could have ADU entries off that center block, let's say, or other kinds of apartments. Here's another big thing that's happening in ethnobirths. Different kinds of domestic units are inhabiting them. Before, the nuclear family which people like Lawrence Stone and Robin Evans would argue was a kind of artificial condition that comes out of the Enlightenment, um, is now, people are coming from cultures that have extended families, and that's a more natural unit. You could argue that's always been a more natural unit than a nuclear family. And so, how do you build a residential environment that accommodates that? Maybe they have a small business, maybe they do that. So, in some ways, urbanity is returning or could return to these places if you define urbanity as a density of social interaction, not necessarily a density of form.
Right.
To
That's
me, I think that's an important distinction.
I like that a lot. Yeah, going back to what you said earlier, to anything to enhance social interaction is at play. I had to look, well, first of all, borrowed upon page 90 to 91. I looked at this picture so much reading the book because I thought, I want to go there. I want to eat there.
Yes, we should have lunch there sometime.
Yeah, I would like to have lunch there. It's very inviting. You say, okay, this is in the burbs, this is in the suburbs. But the social focus is neat. And as you were talking, I was looking up the publication date, 2024. We're going to wrap up the call soon. I have one more question for you, but I want to throw in one just to see, are you doing any work that harkens back to the pandemic or any thoughts on space and social interaction, in Exurbia on the suburb.
Well, the pandemic was enlightening, at least from a social interaction point of view. I was teaching during that time, and instantly, we were all in within 2 weeks, all online. And I have to say that my students didn't like it. And you would think this was the generation that was most comfortable with digital media, and they weren't. They were really thirsting for sort of real time on-site interaction with people. So there's that. One thing I wrote an editorial that was in Common Edge, a blog here in the United States, about maybe using some of these techniques after the fire in Los Angeles that they had in January. The two in Altadena and the other one over in Malibu area. The Altadena one probably being more apt here because it's a less affluent place. But a lot of people potentially might be underwater, not be able to come back because of their insurance companies finding all sorts of conditions. And so one way to do it was to enhance or change the zoning to allow for um, greater residential density as well as sort of functional flexibility within certain range. And this might be a way to bring, pretty quickly people back into communities that they might have been sort of forced out of because they become so expensive. And so it is maybe a piece of the affordability uh, challenge that we have. I'm not suggesting by any means that it's the whole thing. I think economists and politicians really have to work through that one. I've been reading about some cooperatives, conditions in Switzerland and things like that. I think the thing you have to do is pull out the factor of speculation in that whole sort of property ownership thing. As soon as you do that, people are less sort of the system is a little less greedy, and people can just factor in inflation. That's the only thing rather than speculation, which is a kind of hyperinflation, at least in the real estate sector. Again, I'm not an economist. I'm probably saying something most economists might go, "Oh, that's not true," but this is just sort of casual reading on the topic. But it could be a piece of the solution, maybe.
Yeah, I can see you having a very interesting, again, chat with the public, with an economist for public engagement on this issue and on housing and the key to maybe the potentials for the space and housing. I have two final questions. The first one is there anything that surprised you while developing this book?
Hmm. Um, I would surprise. I think what happened. It was a really a kind of slow evolution. You know. I guess I was surprised by the inventiveness of certain people. and certain communities, um, and that I think it suggests that we should always be paying attention to all the built environment. And so, we as designers sort of look at things in a more studied way, if you will, right? But the fact that other people were sort of doing it unconsciously, I think was really interesting. I think the other thing that surprised me is not that many people have done it yet who are architects or who are designers of the built environment. To me, it was one of my motivations to start this. And it's certainly not the last word. I'm sure a lot of other people can start to pitch in and create other ideas, critique the ideas that are in this book. I just hope it begins to initiate a very constructive conversation, about this and maybe some strategies. This was just the kind of tip of the iceberg, I hope, you know. Uh, so yeah, I was surprised that a lot of other architects hadn't done it. I think Teddy Cruz's practice in San Diego is one guy who's consciously thought about this and is a designer too. Albert Pope has written about what he calls ladder cities, which are kind of segregated by their street structures and how we maybe could begin to restore a labyrinth into the city. Uh, and so part of the book here is to sort of informally to suggest that this can be done informally. So yeah.
Well, I think that's really interesting. I think, yeah, I think your response is fascinating. Surprised by the inventiveness of people, and then this, alternately curious, when our architects themselves and urban designers and all of us in the urban sphere shaping the environment in various ways bring this forward themselves, which connects to my last question, in fact. Maybe you just answered it a bit, but what would you like to see more of in terms of research? I'll throw in practice as well, related to suburbs and exurbs. So if you would say the next, couple of decades, what do you think would be really thrilling to see in terms of research, projects, practice, related to this space?
I think architects and other kind of designers, urban designers, what have you, need to really look at how people really behave. And I don't mean like behave in a day, but their larger social patterns. There's a wonderful phrase by Robin Evans is often the most familiar things are buried in the deepest mysteries. In other words, our everyday life is the hardest thing to see. And so I think when you go around and you see people doing things, right? And they're maybe making public space out of a place that generally tries to inhibit publicness, if you will, or interaction. That's a signal that something needs to be done. Something needs to be adjusted, not necessarily in terms of the style or the appearance of the architecture, but what the architecture does, which is always, as you know, programming is always harder than design. And so, um, to me, I think because, being, we're supposedly people who sort of look at this in a more studied way, we should study it and see how those adjustments can be made. I think one of the most interesting things is to look at sort of, shall we say, conservative architecture and see how it's actually becoming progressive. Not so much the style, no. Not the grammar or the aesthetic, but by the way the spaces are being adjusted, particularly in houses, particularly in communities. And then once we understand that, we go, aha, this is something that maybe needs to be more legible in our lives in terms of the way it's designed. Then we as designers can do that and people can see it and it becomes much more explicit and perhaps more powerful. That's what we can do. We can take something that already exists and make it more powerful. So that's what I think we should do. So, it's going to be different everywhere. I'm not saying there's no one size fits all, that's for sure.
Well, I agree, and I'm excited. I was drawn to the book. Um, Firstly, as a person, as simply a person who has inhabited suburban space, I was, well, what is this about? Also, as an advocate for walkable environments via my NGO, and then thirdly, as an urban researcher, they all intersected. I live in the suburbs without prejudice. But
Hmm.
I currently have a good bus connection to the city. I've lived in a dozen suburbs that didn't have
I
any.
own a car.
And my husband drives too, right? So, but I've lived like so many environments where I was dependent on a car or dependent on my husband to drive me. So I'm well aware. In walkability advocacy, I always say everybody's welcome to the table, including if you drive. We need people who drive at the table, advocating for walkability. Those are amongst the people we need the most, I think, at the table because a lot of them would like another way or thinking of all the dependents that are dependent on mom and or dad who drives and so forth. So, and this is really that's to me one of the biggest challenges for the suburbs now is this connectivity aspect. But we have best practices to look at, and that's why I appreciate your book. You're presenting solutions too, and interesting at the end there. Uh, this Willingboro, this
Yeah, yeah,
that
it's
was
it's
interesting.
one of the Levitt. That was just a subject that had been really well documented, so we used it
Mm,
as a kind of test case to try some of these theories. One of the older Levitt towns outside of Philadelphia,
mhm,
just northeast of Philadelphia. I mean, I think walkability is really important. It affects scale, and what this can do is to restore a walkable scale to a community. And organically over time, I suppose they'll salt in the programs that they need,
mhm.
right? Over
Yeah.
time. There's a zoning diagram which has Willingboro separate, functionally segregated programming and then more mixed up, as a kind of first step.
I believe in the future of walkable suburbs. Not everybody wants to live in the city center or a dense urban quarter. A lot of people want to live, in a space that's different in suburban space. But I also believe we need to be able to promote walkability in those spaces, and that it's totally possible. Sometimes the culture is lacking, as you and I know, as U.S. Americans. Driving culture is the dominant paradigm in so many places, including I was in California a couple of years ago. I was in a suburb in North County that had picture perfect sidewalks. Picture perfect. They were accessible. If you were in a wheelchair, they were accessible. They looked new, but there was nobody walking but me and my children. We were just there for a couple of weeks. There was nobody walking. There was no
Mm.
culture. So I really also value how you bring up this social dimension and really emphasize the social dimension. To me, that's part of the culture.
That's where the functions come in, the different kinds
Yeah.
of functions. Because as you're walking, one of the reasons that's so empty is that there's only one function. It's only
Mhm.
residential.
Yeah.
If you had other functions and you had to go walk a block or two to go get something that you need to do every day, that might begin to change.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Making
functions
it
are really
efficient.
important to pay attention to.
Right. And your book documents that. It not only documents it, it shows it also, it shows it in text, it shows it in pictures. You can really see it too. So
Mhm.
I would like to end this by suggesting to viewers, if you found this interesting, definitely check out the book, Rewriting Exurbia, The
I can
People in Aging Sprawl, right? By
aging
Professor.
sprawl, older sprawl.
In what?
In aging sprawl, yes,
Yes.
correct.
Yes.
Means older sprawl, existing sprawl.
Right. So I will include the link to that also when I post this, and I look forward to continued dialogue and thank you for today.
Excellent. Fantastic. Thank you.